Hello, and welcome to the Peas Fireside Chat. My name is Jessica Chopin-Roney, and I am the director of the program in Early American Economy and Society, which is hosting tonight's event. It is my great pleasure to introduce you to our speaker and to the person who will be interviewing them. Before I begin, I would like to start by thanking Grace Harrington, who is the coordinator for events at the Library Company, and thank her for setting us up for all of this. I would also like to make a quick plug to all of our listeners to support the Library Company. We know that historical institutions and community institutions and all kinds of scholarly institutions are under threat from various forces. And so I urge you to consider supporting the Library Company and the good programming it does. It has been around for nearly 300 years. We're coming up on our 300th anniversary. And in all of that time has been serving the mission of propagating knowledge that it was originally put together to do. So I urge you to help us keep doing the good work. I also want to announce two events that are coming up. The first is a conference, which is in just under a month. On February 7th, we will be open the celebration of peas. We're not quite as old as the Library Company, but we are 25 years old now, this program. And so we are having a conference to celebrate called Peas at 25, Retrospect and Prospect. So we will be celebrating the accomplishments of Peas in the first 25 years, celebrating its director for that entire run, Kathy Matson, and we will be turning our attention forward to what the next 25 years of Peas might look like. What are the big questions? Where is the heat in the field? What kinds of things should Peas be doing to help support the scholarly conversation going forward? And then the other event I want to let you, that is free and open to the public, so please register. And I want to let you know about our next Fireside Chat, which will be on February 18th with Justine Hill Edwards, who will be at the Peas at 25 conference. She is an advisory council member for Peas. And she also has a fantastic new book out with Norton called Savings and Trust, The Rise and Betrayal of the Freedmen's Bank. So she and I will be chatting about her book on February 18th at another virtual Fireside Chat event, and I hope you will join us. But now let me turn to introducing our speakers, and if they're willing to turn on their cameras, you'll get to see them. The first is Sarah Gronningsater, who is an assistant professor of history at the University of Pennsylvania, just down the way from us here in Philadelphia. She got her undergraduate degree from Harvard, her master's at Oxford University, and a PhD from the University of Chicago. She's gotten a number of prestigious awards, but I choose to focus on the fact that she was the Barra Postdoctoral Fellow at the McNeil Center for Early American Studies for 2 years, which is where I got to meet her. She's the author of several book chapters and journal articles in publications like the William and Mary Quarterly and the Journal of the Civil War, which gives you a real sense of the sort of temporal span of her scholarship, which you're also going to see in tonight's talk about her book. Let's see, I lost my place. And she focuses on African American voting, legal practices, citizenship, and democracy in the long 19th century. Her most recent publication, The Rising Generation, sorry, my computer's messing with me, but there it is, Gradual Abolition, Black Legal Culture, and the Making of National Freedom, was published by Penn Press in 2024 and is the subject of today's chat. In addition to her scholarly work, Sarah is an important member of the academic community, winning multiple teaching awards since she started at Penn, which is really impressive. And as a regular participant of many different historical institutions and societies in Philly and nationally and internationally. She is also generously serving Peas this winter as the outside reader for a book manuscript workshop for the other person on your screen right now, Carolyn Zola. Dr. Zola is the current Peas postdoc. She received her PhD in history from Stanford University last year. And her current book project is entitled Public Women, Urban Provisioners, and the Rise of American Capitalism. and it explores the lives and labors of female food sellers, Black and white, free and enslaved, immigrant and native-born, who hawked their wares in North American port cities during the 18th and 19th centuries. So Sarah and Carolyn are going to engage in a talk, and I am going to slide on out and enjoy with the rest of you. So thank you so much and welcome to the event.
Jess, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. As Jess mentioned, she and I first met back at the McNeil Center over a decade ago, and she's been such a wonderful reader and organizer and gatherer and supporter of younger scholars. And I'm really grateful to be here this evening at her invitation and with all of you who've tuned in. Thank you for Grace at the Library Company for organizing this. Carolyn, thank you so much for reading my book and being willing to have this conversation with me. I'm going to start this evening just with a few slides explaining the main content of the book and showing you a few images. It'll only be about 5-ish minutes, but I thought it'd be useful to sort of lay some groundwork around the book, and then Carolyn and I will have a discussion. So I'm going to share my screen with you all. Okay, there we go. So this book is called The Rising Generation, Gradual Abolition, Black Legal Culture, and the Making of National Freedom. And the main thing that this book is about is the generation of Black children who were born in New York between the 1790s and the 1830s, and how they helped expand and create national freedom in the 1860s and 1870s. I focus particularly on New York, and I have to say I realize I'm at the Library Company of Pennsylvania. We're in Philadelphia. Pennsylvania is actually quite important to my story too, but New York is the main focus for a couple of reasons. One is just because of its position as a particularly powerful political state in the Union over the course of the 19th century. In the words of a contemporary proverb, as New York goes, so goes the Union. It had the most massive number of electoral votes, supplied a number of vice presidents and presidents, major leaders of the political parties. New York was an important swing state as well. So if you're sort of tracking the politics and the major transformations of the 19th century United States, New York is a fundamental state to follow. The other reason that New York is particularly important for my story is just because of the particular history of slavery in New York. This is a book about slavery and anti-slavery. And among the northern states, as this map shows you, New York in its colonial era was deeply committed to slavery. When I teach my undergraduate students at Penn, it often shocks them to see that in 1770, there were actually more enslaved people being forced to labor in New York than in the state of Georgia. And so undoing slavery there was a quite important political and legal and social process. Slaveholding in New York State was mostly found among English and Dutch settlers up and down the Hudson River Valley and on Long Island. And so part of the point of this book, too, is to really think about slavery as not simply an urban phenomenon, but a deeply rural one as well. And so the rural story is important to me in this book. And as New York itself moves into territory that had been formerly Haudenosaunee, or what the French called the Iroquois, slavery and also free Black people move into the western parts of the state as well. So the rising generations connected arguments are that New York State and its people are particularly important to the history of emancipation in the United States. I focus a lot on the book, not just on famous people, although there are definitely famous people in the book, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, but the thousands of ordinary Black New Yorkers who helped forge emancipation in the state and in the nation. And I'm particularly interested in this generation of Black children born after the American Revolution. Now, the reason that this generation was so unique was because of New York's 1799 Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery. Now, New York was not the only state to pass an act like this. Pennsylvania actually went first in 1780. But what these laws did is say that after a certain date, children of enslaved mothers would be technically free at birth, but they would have to work as servants until adulthood. In New York, girls would work until age 25, boys until 28. But they were born into this different status. They were technically free. They were technically servants, which was its own category at law. And they had certain rights as servants that enslaved people didn't. Now, of course, this all depended on whether you can make those rights real in practice, and the book is very much about that. But this, I think, helps explain, at least preliminarily, why this generation was different and why they were unique. I collected a lot of information about this generation by looking at archives across New York State. So towns, for example, were required to keep birth certificates, birth registries of these children born into this special status. I also looked at a lot of local legal records, and I'm sure Carolyn and I will talk about these archives more in the talk, but I wanted to give you a sense of sort of what my source base was and how I found information about this particular generation. Another place that I looked a lot were schools. Black children were in schools across the state in the early 1800s. And one thing that I'd like to stress here very briefly is the fact that it's girls and boys going to school. So this generation is, it is a co-ed generation. And I'm certainly attuned to the ways that gender affected various experiences of freedom and interactions with the law. But both girls and boys, and then men and women as they're grown up, are important to this story. I take the term the rising generation from some of the mentors and parents and teachers of this special generation. And I just wanted to give a quick shout out to the Library Company of Philadelphia, and sort of Jess's point earlier about just how important these institutions are. The Library Company of Philadelphia has, I think, one of the few surviving copies of this address delivered before the African Female Benevolent Society of Troy, which was a small city directly across the Hudson River from Albany, the state capital of New York. And this Black teacher in the 1830s is addressing an audience, explaining the importance of this rising generation, this generation of young people coming into adulthood who have opportunities and responsibilities that were different than the generations before. One of the things that this generation does as they become adults is they start changing state laws. They petition the legislature, they vote, they create relationships with lawmakers. This is something I particularly like this example because it cites a petition of fathers and mothers, right? It's both men and women are part of this generation and the work that they're doing in courts and in legislatures. So ultimately, sort of the payoff of the book, when you get to sort of the end of it, is I hope both an appreciation of what gradual abolition was like on the ground for this unique generation, what their experiences were, and also the fact that I think we can better understand important parts of our national constitution and federal civil rights legislation if we understand why this generation fought to include the Civil War and Reconstruction amendments into our body of national law. So I think for many people on this Zoom, the idea of the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments is familiar. What I'm hoping for readers of this book is that there'll be sort of new ways of thinking of how did we get these amendments and why were they fought for and who was pushing for them. And the ideas that were in those amendments weren't created overnight. They were created in part by this earlier generation of free Black Northerners and the work that they did in law and politics. So to finish up, just this little part, not the whole evening, just to finish up the slideshow, you can see just from the contents of this book, it begins in the early modern and colonial era, before New York was even an independent state, and ends with the Civil War and Reconstruction in chapter 7. And so with that, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and welcome this conversation that we get to have with Carolyn.
Hi, thank you so much. That was such a great overview. And I think sort of helps really situate us in our conversation. I also want to offer my thanks to Jess and to Grace and everybody at the Library Company for organizing both this event and all of these conversations. I've been attendee at many of them, and they're always so invigorating. So to sort of start early on in your own book, I'm going to quote your book to you. So early on, you write, in 1799, freedom and personal autonomy were neither legally nor conceptually synonymous. This might seem sort of surprising to readers who are accustomed to thinking in that modern register, who think about these two concepts as essentially the same. Could you elaborate on that insight and what it meant for Black New Yorkers, both free and enslaved?
It might seem sort of strange to us to think, Carolyn, can you hear me okay?
You froze for a second, or maybe I did, but yes, I'm back.
Okay. I'm so sorry about that. So the 1799 law that I mentioned in the slideshow uses the phrase born free and suggests that these children are born free. And I think to a modern, 21st century reader, to be like, how is this freedom? You're immediately forced to work for a master. You're the adult in charge of you, of your labor, of your food, of your clothing, isn't even your own parent. How is this freedom? In the context of the 1700s, a lot of legal commentators and the people who wrote this law wouldn't have thought this was strange. And so to them, for example, women are technically free. That doesn't mean they can vote. In some cases, they can't own property. In some cases, they don't even have control over their own wages. Their property goes to their husband, right? They might not even get custody of their own children in the case of sort of marital strife, right? Poor people, even like poor white people in this time period, also can have their labor coerced. They can be forced to live in other households. And so in some ways, when lawmakers say these children are born free, in some ways that's quite radical, right? This is like undoing partus sequitur ventum. It's saying that enslaved mothers' children no longer inherit that racialized status of slavery. This is a break with the past. But on the other hand, freedom is not sort of this equalizing radical thing that it may come to mean later in the 19th century or in our modern parlance. And so one of the things I think is so interesting is some of the lawmakers who were very comfortable saying these children are free, they weren't in other ways particularly interested in toppling existing hierarchies and existing forms of labor coercion. And one of the big questions, which is a live question at the time, is even if these children are going to be born free, are they going to be given the opportunities to inhabit equal adulthoods regardless of race? I would say in some ways there's even more conversation about the possibilities that Black boys might grow up and have the same rights as Black men. But for example, no one in the 1790s is thinking that a Black girl is going to grow up and vote, right? So I think we can sort of see that the freedom is real in some concrete ways, and in other ways, it's a very different definition of freedom than we consider 100 or 200 years later.
Yeah, that's right. Much more narrow and much more embedded in this sort of very 18th century hierarchical world. That sort of the patriarchal household is the organizing unit.
Yes.
Yeah, and so to sort of follow up on one of the points you mentioned there, in terms of poor white people, servants, the poor law broadly really ended up shaping gradual emancipation in New York. Could you elaborate on that a little and sort of connect those two stories, which I think are often thought of separately?
Yes. So one of the reasons that I really wanted to start this book before the American Revolution is because in some of the historiography, and by the way, I am standing on the shoulder of giants. There's really good work on gradual abolition. There's great work on the revolution, but we all know this. There's like sometimes this tendency to be like, and then the world began in 1776. But that's not true, right? The people writing these laws, the enslaved people affected by this, they're not beginning life on July 4th of 1776. They are entering this revolutionary era, this new independent nation with all of these colonial legacies, including legal legacies. And so the people who are proposing these gradual abolition laws are very familiar with these colonial practices dealing with the poor. And so when they propose ideas for gradual emancipation, and these proposals are circulating starting in the late 1600s, particularly among Quakers. So even at the start of the revolution, there is a sort of intellectual public conversation about what gradual emancipation might look like. And the people in power who are considering it, they say, look, we already sort of do this with poor children. We already coerce the labor of poor children. We make them live with masters. We say that they have to labor until their 20s. And so if we're going to get rid of slavery, great, we already have a system. This system was also regulated at the town level. So towns in the colonial era and the early republic had elected officials called overseers of the poor. And these are local politicians, usually sort of, local landowners. These are sort of elite men who are in charge of raising taxes for the poor, for binding out poor children, for kicking out people they don't want in the town, right? I mean, there's also this sort of inside outside, do you belong, do you not element of poor law. And so when northern state lawmakers begin writing laws for gradual emancipation, they sort of assume that the audience knows all of this, right? It'll, like, these laws say things like, as though they were pauper servants, the overseers of the poor are going to be in charge of this. The same rules as is done for indentured servants. So they're taking a long-standing poor law system or servant system and implanting it on these generations of Black children. And I would say one thing I just want to highlight is most of the laws in the states that do this end up requiring these Black children to work longer terms than white children would have, right? So in some ways, these children are treated like white pauper children or white poor children, but this is a racialized poor law system. And in the case of these gradual abolition laws, these Black children are required to serve longer than their white counterparts. And that's actually one of the things that anti-slavery Black and white New Yorkers fight to change in the state legislature. And in New York, they actually somewhat succeed, and the age is lowered to closer to when white children are freed from their pauper servitude.
Picking up on the idea, sort of these Black New Yorkers and their white allies who are pushing for all sorts of change across the 19th century, I was really fascinated by the degree to which a whole range of, especially Black New Yorkers across class and education spectrums, really displayed an incredible grasp of the law and a savvy in the way that they used it and used it to sort of push for issues relating to the end of slavery or Black citizenship rights. How did they develop and sort of disperse this legal knowledge?
So thank you so much for highlighting that part of the book, because I think that is really important. I think there are some really inspiring, incredible Black and white elites in this book who are, publishing brilliant legal treaties, and they write these editorials, and they're giving amazing speeches, and they're very important. But equally important is just sort of the grassroots, ordinary Black families, mothers, fathers, children, teachers, workers, who have a really, as you note, strong sense of the law. And they get this understanding of the law in a number of ways. So one is churches. So sort of Black institutions so I love this example of David Ruggles, who's sort of he's an Underground Railroad conductor, and he's also sort of part of like vigilance committees that sort of protect Black people from being kidnapped. Every time that the state legislature passes a new law relevant to Black New Yorkers, he holds these big meetings in churches, and he announces, right? He's like, everybody has to know that this new law exists, because there's no point in having a good new law unless people can sort of enforce it on the streets. So you might be like an elderly grandmother who hasn't learned to read and write, but if you know this rule in this law and you hear a rumor that someone's being held in slavery against that person's will, you need to know what the new rules are. And there are cases where that elderly grandmother saves somebody from either getting kidnapped or from slavery because of that local knowledge. Another way it happens is through schools. So the gradual abolition happens to coincide with the growth of the common school system. So what we now think of as sort of as public schools begin to grow across the state in the early 1800s, and many towns, even in small areas, have Black schools. Some of the schools are integrated. In a lot of cases, there's a school for quote unquote colored children. And so when you look at what's happening in these schools, some of it is we're going to teach children or children's parents what the new laws are. And the last example I'll give, although honestly I could keep going because there's sort of multifaceted ways the law gets disseminated, is just in local courts, county courts. If courtrooms, I guess technically if I wanted to like go to court tomorrow and see what was happening in the county courthouse, I could, but it's not part of most of our daily culture. The court being sort of open for session in both cities and rural areas was a public sort of open thing. And so even enslaved people and free Black people could often find themselves in a court during important cases, and sometimes even local, more obscure cases, and watch the law at work. And so part of what I see, especially in some of sort of the major famous cases I talk about, is newspapers will mention the fact that, the galleries are filled with Black men, women, and children. And they're, crowded into the stairways and into the spaces outside. So that's another way in which sort of law and sort of court procedure are part of like everyday life in a way that may not be as familiar to us today.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, it doesn't feel like sort of part of the fabric of necessarily everyday life in that same way, although I'm sure for many it is, but in more consequential ways. So thinking of that grandmother and David Ruggles, just the broad spectrum of people involved in these fights. And so both men and women were very actively engaged, in children too, as you discuss. But how did gender shape the ways in which different individuals push for these different rights, whether it be school or suffrage or anti-slavery mobilizing?
So I'll give a couple of examples. So one of the things I think that's important to consider in sort of the way the patterns of slaveholding worked in the colonial era and into the early 19th century is that slaveholding was quite widespread in New York, meaning many, many white households had slaves, but the number of slaves in a given household was usually small. And in this, so that would often mean that like families didn't necessarily live together. And it often meant too, in many households, that sort of there was a gender divide of work, right? So women, for example, or girls might be in the kitchens and gardens, doing childcare, cooking, as sort of doing domestic labor. Boys and men might be working on the docks in sort of the port economy, traveling on the rivers and the roads of the Hudson River Valley. So sort of just where people are in time and space is somewhat different, like based on gender. And one of the ways that I think there's a number of ways it's interesting, but I'll give like a small example. I rely in some part on the records of the New York Manumission Society. And this was an elite and then Quaker, so not necessarily entirely elite, but sort of like elite white politician and Quaker anti-slavery organization that lobbied for new state laws and also served as lawyers on behalf of enslaved and free Black people who were trying to protect their freedom. And if you look at the standing committee minutes of this society and the legal work that they're doing, there are pages after pages where it's all women coming to them. It's a woman who's a cook, and she'll come in and say, I'm a cook. I live next door to this child. I'm worried that this child isn't being educated according to the gradual abolition laws. Is there anything you can do? And I think because women are in these sort of particular domestic spaces, and so they might either be taking care of children or see where children are, they play a particularly important role in raising awareness about children who are under harm. And I'll just say like one other very quick thing about this. It's interesting as we move into the 19th century and this generation sort of grows up and they become adults. There's actually sort of there are a couple conversations about like, well, should the women be petitioning the legislature, right? Like, is this an okay thing for women to do? Right. And this is a time period. I mean, anyone who knows like the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, this is like, there's larger conversations about sort of women's role, women's property, Seneca Falls, et cetera. And the sort of elite men come down and like, no, the women they have a stake in this. Like they should be allowed to petition the legislature. So when you look at the petitions to the legislature, it'll often say mothers and fathers, men and women. And so Black men actually encourage, in many cases, Black women to take on certain, not all, kinds of public political roles.
Fascinating. You touched on the sort of gender division of labor in this period and sort of where Black men were versus where most Black women were. And it made me think of a really fascinating character that you talk about. We could probably spend this whole hour talking about him. Louis Napoleon, who I think is a very significant but maybe underappreciated anti-slavery figure in the 1840s and 50s. And part of that is connected to his work. And I was just wondering if you could sort of tell us a little bit more about him.
Thank you so much. I love Louis Napoleon and any chance to talk about him. So Louis Napoleon was born around 1800. So in some ways, he's a paradigmatic sort of child of this generation that I'm interested in. He does not come from a particularly elite background. According to census records, he doesn't know how to read and write, right? So he's a laborer. He's not someone who's writing editorials or giving sort of famous speeches in churches or anything like that. His main contribution is the just incredible role he played on the Underground Railroad. And Eric Foner has, his great book, Gateway to Freedom, is a lot about Louis Napoleon's work on the Underground Railroad. And there's actually sort of records of like the thousands of runaway slaves who he helped get to freedom. I am particularly interested in his role in what I sometimes call like the overground, like not the underground, but the sort of the public, the above ground railroad. What he ends up doing in collaboration with a bunch of white lawyers, including John Jay, the grandson of the more famous John Jay. So there's sort of a generational story here among sort of white anti-slavery folks too. But Louis Napoleon and John Jay end up over a series about like 10 to 15 years, getting a number of slaves into court and then freed by New York's courts. And Louis Napoleon, he was deeply networked. It's clear if you start reading letters that he sort of knew everybody in both sort of Black and white anti-slavery circles in New York and even the wider Northeast, because he needed to make sure that sort of people got free on the Underground Railroad, even when he freed them in courts. And so what he seems to have done is he had sort of like a network of collaborators and spies in the ports and even on ships going up and down the coast of the East Coast. And if there were ever slaves being brought into New York or about to be kidnapped, he often found ways to get them into court and using New York laws to free them. I think in some ways, what's sort of interesting about it is there are some public references to him in newspapers and sort of court documents. But if you think about the danger of his work and what he was doing, it would have been dangerous if he were too famous, right? Like, so in some ways, the importance of his work actually had to be kept secret. But I think that's part of the reason we haven't known as much about sort of the significance that he had until sort of recent books and hopefully my book, where we can sort of make Louis Napoleon more of a household name.
Definitely. Here's to that. Across these different generations or sort of across this rising generation that you discuss, Black New Yorkers, as you make, I think, very clear, are shaping both local, state, and then national politics. So could you talk a little bit about the ways that Black New Yorkers and their white allies shape the aims and the outcomes of the Civil War and the course of Reconstruction? A small question.
Yeah. So I want to answer this in a couple of ways. So the first is, for historians of the early Republic, we know how much is left up to the states within the federal system. Slavery as a question is basically left up to the individual states, right? So this is why after, we get the 1787 Constitution, and even actually before that under the Articles of Confederation, different states make different decisions. South Carolina decides to reopen the slave trade at the same time that we have Massachusetts state courts and sort of grassroots activity on the ground that's abolishing slavery there, right? So it's happening in different states. And there are 5 states, including New York and Pennsylvania, that pass gradual abolition laws, for example. So within that system that leaves so many questions about slavery, also about citizenship and voting up to the state, the Black New Yorkers that I write about are very focused on what's going on in their state, right? Like so much of their daily lives are being regulated by the state. And often the state delegates the particular sort of things that matter to their daily lives to local areas. So they sort of are toggling, like there might be a new state law, but it's implemented by the local Board of Education. And so they sort of have to both know who's on my local Board of Education and who's my state representative in Albany. So the first part of the book is really about sort of these state stories. But what I try to show is that as Black New Yorkers push their state to be more anti-slavery, because of that larger federal system I just described, it means that New York is starting to get into fights with some of the slave states. So New York, for example, might pass a law, and it does at the behest of Black New Yorkers, saying that it is no longer legal to bring any slave into New York State. There's no law of slavery here. You cannot like too bad, Southerner, that you want to go spend like your hot, humid August in the resort towns of upstate New York. You cannot bring your slaves with you. We don't allow slaves here, right? And so New York passes that law at the behest of Black New Yorkers. But what happens when those Southerners bring their slaves into the state? And then you have New York judges, New York governors, New York legislatures they have to take a stand. And so as Black New Yorkers push white New Yorkers and the state government to take a stand, sectional tensions rise. And so part of what I chart in sort of the penultimate chapter of the book is just how much the very tensions created by those sorts of questions are part of what leads to the outbreak of the Civil War. When South Carolina declares secession in December of 1860, it lays out a long list of why South Carolina feels it needs to leave the Union and specifically blames New York's courts. And New York's courts were doing the things that Black New Yorkers pushed them to do. When the war itself starts, Black New Yorkers are pushing the federal government from the beginning. They're pushing their US senators, they're pushing their congressmen. William Seward is Lincoln's Secretary of State, former governor of New York, is pushing national lawmakers to end slavery immediately, not gradually, right? They're like, we did this gradual thing, we didn't like it very much, please end it immediately, none of this pauper servitude stuff. We need equal citizenship. We need definitions of citizenship. We need voting rights. And so my argument in the final chapter is that their experiences with this Northern style emancipation prepared them, the second the Civil War starts, to advocate for certain kinds of national outcomes, including constitutional amendments, which they are very aware it's harder to change a constitution than it is to change a statute. They know that. And so they want these new freedoms, these new definitions of citizenship, new voting rights written into the nation's body of fundamental law, and they want corresponding civil rights legislation passed by the national legislature, just the way they'd push for similar laws in their own state legislature.
Yeah, it really helped me think about a very familiar story from a totally new perspective. I really appreciated that. I could keep talking about the book for several more hours, but we only have a bit more time. I'm hoping folks are throwing questions that they might have in the chat. I'll be getting to those in a couple of minutes, but I first wanted to just ask you a couple of questions about kind of process. So archives, you draw on a lot of archives, and I just sort of, one way of putting the question is how, but maybe more specifically, sort of how did you track these different figures across archives? It seems like you're finding information about them from multiple different collections. How did you decide which archives to explore? Life is but short. How do you, prioritize? And just generally any reflections you have on the archival experience.
Yeah, so I feel like it's probably most helpful to you and to the audience to be just as like so transparent and honest as possible, which was this took a long time. And I say that in part if there are sort of graduate students in the audience or people sort of transitioning from dissertation to book, I'm sure that I hope there are some, is, there were moments when I felt like, people who I'd started graduate school with were publishing their books before me. And I was like, I'm behind. And in some ways that was true. But I took years of road trips across New York State. One thing that I just want to give a huge shout out here is to librarians and archivists at sort of small, underfunded rural historical societies. Many of these archives exist in town clerks and county clerks' offices that are there to this day. So I would go to a county clerk's office and the two people in front of me would be like getting like pistol licenses or like trying to look up like a property deed for their grandparents' house, like sort of like present issues. And then I'd show up and be like, do you have stuff from 250 years ago? And sometimes they were very nice. And sometimes they were like, we have no idea what you're talking about. And sometimes they were like, I don't really want to deal with you today. Right. So, I had the whole like range of experiences, but a lot of people were super kind and helpful. And then some of it was just like, this is the last thing I'll say about this, but I'm sure there's also people in here who can relate to this. I started doing this research, like, oh God, it was probably like 2009, 2010, like before we had smartphones, right? So like part of it, I just have like physical photocopies. Like I just like the actual like material of the archive. I've been working on it so long that like the technology has changed. And so now if I want to like find, let's say I like am trying to trace a certain child whose birth certificate I have, and then I want to go through the census records, I can just like type in the name in iPhoto, and like iPhoto can like kind of read handwriting from 250 years ago. Like that's a game changer. like when I was first drafting the book, none of this existed. But I'm glad I don't know. It took a long time, but I think I'm glad I took the time too. So that tells you a little bit about the process. And Carolyn, I know you're going through the same, like a lot of your records are also unpublished and local and people who are hard to find. And I can't wait to read your manuscript, and everyone on this Zoom is going to be excited to do your fireside chat in a few years.
I'll meet you all back here in between 10 and 20 years. But yeah, I mean, I very much relate to the finding these figures who feel so important and so whose lives I think deserve consideration. But you get like a glimpse of them. You find a few little facts, maybe their name, maybe not even that. Were there people that you were sort of searching for but kind of couldn't find enough about and weren't able to include?
Absolutely. And I would say this is the part too where I would say a couple of things, particularly about those birth certificates, right? So in some ways I know that, I mean, hundreds, like probably, well, like thousands, actually, I have the names of these children who were born. In many cases, it's the first name, but not the last name, right? So like, I know a child named Nan was born in this month to an enslaved mother, and maybe I know her first name, but I'm not given a last name, right? And like, you're like, it's heartbreaking in like multiple ways to not be able to say more. I mean, the other thing that's difficult is like, there's a lot of common names, right? So there's, like there's 100 young girls named Matilda. It was a popular name at the time, right? So I think the difficulty sometimes there, and there actually is a Matilda Williams, who I know won a public speaking prize at her school in 1817. And she's the daughter of Peter Williams, who's a Black Episcopalian priest. And I know that Matilda Williams, I can trace her a little bit. But there's an editorial written by a woman named Matilda, and I don't know if it's her, right? So like, it's actually like, wouldn't be a bad guess, but those are the moments where you try to be as responsible as you can, and sort of like, and I did in the writing, I did in the writing sometimes, I think, transparently try to make those connections, right? And sort of say like, we can't know for sure, but it is plausible that. But this is for anyone who does social history, who does the history of enslaved people, who does the history of poor people, does the history of women. Like, there's just some information you're never going to have. But to your point, it is, to me, entirely worth trying to say as much as we can responsibly.
Yeah, and I appreciated throughout the book, but I think with great restraint, you sort of would probe the sort of the possibilities of what you could know. And I appreciated the balance you took. I mean, I could write a whole book just sort of saying, maybe this is what these women, who this was or what they were doing. And I think, it's an important seasoning, but sometimes needs to be, peppered along with other ingredients. I use a lot of cooking metaphors because of the nature of my project. Apologies. So we're getting some questions in the chat. One about the sort of the connection between New York's Gradual Abolition Act and then similar but very different story in Pennsylvania. Could you sort of talk about the two? I was also thinking about how in some ways these stories are very similar, but also unfold in really different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say, so the 5 states that passed gradual abolition laws, it's Pennsylvania that goes first. Connecticut and Rhode Island go a few years later. It's a much harder fight in New York. So Pennsylvania, Connecticut, and Rhode Island are in 1780, and then sort of the mid 1780s, and New York's not till 1799. And New Jersey goes last in 1804. Meanwhile, Massachusetts sort of abolishes slavery through a combination of court decisions and sort of like on the ground, sort of unraveling of slavery in sort of local households. Vermont technically abolishes slavery, even though it's at that point it's an independent republic in its state constitution. And New Hampshire's constitution, there were very few slaves there, but it was sort of interpreted to end slavery. And I would just say it's like a whole other thing is you have the question of the Northwest Ordinance, which sort of in what become the Midwest states, but at the time in the 1780s are territory, further slavery is not allowed to be introduced, which is just, I just think it's always worth keeping in mind. The states that become what we call the North in the Civil War actually each have similarities in their experience, but also quite distinct ways of dealing with questions of slavery and citizenship. So Pennsylvania goes first in 1780. Largely because of the activism of Quakers and the particular story of Pennsylvania in the course of the American Revolution. I'm sure many people on this Zoom know that Pennsylvania's first state constitution in many ways is one of the most radical and democratic. So this is a state where there's sort of some of the more radical patriots. There's a large Quaker population. The Quakers are very anti-slavery from the, let me be careful with this. Quakers say anti-slavery things for a long time. They start really doing stuff in the 1750s and 60s, but there are more Quakers in Pennsylvania than in any other northern state. When when Pennsylvania lawmakers are considering a gradual abolition law in 1779, the story is that Quaker abolitionist Anthony Benezet visits every single lawmaker to urge its passage, right? So this is sort of, the cake gets, sorry, Carolyn, I'm doing your cooking analogies now. The cake gets baked in a certain way in Pennsylvania. Now, ways that that model for Pennsylvania is very important to New York. New York's Quakers and elite politicians are very aware that Pennsylvania has done this. Quakers, for those of you who study them, are really good at writing letters. They're very much in touch with each other across state lines. So Quakers from New York and Pennsylvania are writing back and forth about sort of Pennsylvania did this, like, how do we get this done in New York? John Jay, who I mentioned earlier, like, he's the New York governor who ends up actually approving the 1799 law in the 1780s, writes to the New York Attorney General and says, we should pass a law like Pennsylvania's, right? So like, I think that's one thing to say just about how important Pennsylvania is as a model. Now, Pennsylvania is also different in some interesting ways. Pennsylvania technically allows, for example, Black men to vote in the late 1700s and early 1800s. For political historians who've worked on Pennsylvania, there's some really interesting analysis on why there's actually not a lot of Black voting in Philadelphia proper. Van Goss, however, like a really careful political historian, has shown how much there was sort of robust Black voting in rural areas, but Pennsylvania adopts a new constitution in 1838 that completely disfranchises Black men. I don't want to keep on sort of just talking about Pennsylvania and New York being different, but so Pennsylvania, I would say in its gradual abolition process, the last actually quick thing I will say about this as a point of comparison is Pennsylvania has the PAS, the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, which is somewhat similar to the New York Manumission Society that I mentioned for New York. And the PAS is really important as sort of an advocacy arm for enslaved and free Black people. But it doesn't, from what I understand, have sort of as much long-term sway with passing new state laws as the New York Manumission Society did. So for example, the New York Manumission Society has John Jay is in it, Alexander Hamilton is in it, James Duane, the mayor of New York, is in it, James Kent, the most important state judge. There are certainly some elite Pennsylvanians who are sort of interested in this, but the particular sort of political makeup, and I think the way the Federalist Party plays in Pennsylvania creates sort of different outcomes for white and Black anti-slavery in Pennsylvania. And the last thing I'll say about this, again, because I just want to give full credit to Pennsylvania, also has a number of really important sort of Black activists, Black churches, Black schools. Like, my point is not that New York's the only game in town, but they are different for some of the reasons I've begun to suggest.
Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah, and Pennsylvania's the story there, and the activism there, and the Black organizations and schools and religious institutions are very, very important and interesting in their own right. It just was, I'm a little more familiar with I've been thinking about Pennsylvania more since I've been here, and it just occurred to me that, like, oh, place matters, specifics sort of matter. A historiographic question from the chat from Aaron Zelnick. Your book seems to be part of a new wave of scholarship about abolitionism and early legal culture. How would you characterize these new findings on abolition? Where are we today as opposed to, say, a few decades ago?
Yeah, so I mean, I mentioned earlier that, and I say this like with like such sincere like sort of gratitude for the fact that I was able to sort of write a book after there'd been an earlier wave of interest on gradual abolition and slavery in the North. I mean, going back to, I mean, I read Ira Berlin's Many Thousands Gone when I was a sophomore in college, and that book holds up, right? And then, like, I mean, that's like sort of an early, and it's famous sort of article about sort of like time and place in American slavery, and thinking about the fact that slavery is perfectly legal in all 13 colonies on the eve of the revolution, but it looks different in various regions. And Berlin himself sort of talks about like various generations. And people like Leslie Harris, who actually has a phenomenal and out-of-print edited collection on slavery in New York. It's edited by Ira Berlin and Leslie Harris. Leslie Harris also has her own book, In the Shadow of Slavery. Craig Stephen Wilder, Graham Hodges. I mean, I could just like keep on listing people, but Joanne Pope Mellish on the Northeast, Gary Nash on Pennsylvania, Gene Sutherland, et cetera. That's sort of, I would say, the generation, like, or the scholar sort of right before me working on gradual abolition, I think did incredibly important work on sort of the social history, the institutional history, the labor history of slavery and gradual abolition. This question is correct that like I'm in sort of like this next generation that's really, I think, more interested than those earlier scholars, or also just because they had to do the work of getting it done first. And so that's why this is the nice thing, is like young historians get to write new things because not everybody can do everything. I think this younger generation has been particularly interested in formal law and politics. And this is, you know, Martha Jones writing about Baltimore, Steve Kantrowitz writing about Massachusetts, Paul Polgar writing about sort of the first emancipators, Manisha Sinha's book. I think sort of, I'm definitely part of sort of this wave that's actually sort of interested in sort of Black people in courts, in legislatures, as part of the party system. I mentioned Van Goss earlier. And so in some ways, I don't think that this new wave is in any way, I mean, I would say for the most part I think some historiographies, when there's like a transformation, it's sort of undoing something, right? Or it's saying they got this wrong, or this is a wildly new interpretation. I actually would say this current is taking sort of the really wonderful foundational historiography that existed, and then taking those characters into new places and asking new questions. And I would say this is one thing that I feel very strongly about. I did, when I was sort of reading that earlier literature, I worry it would have maybe sort of seemed surprising, for example, like Henry Highland Garnett is a character in my book who in the 1830s and 40s is meeting with state lawmakers on the state judiciary committee to try to pass new laws. And I think some of that earlier literature, you might have been surprised by that, right? Like, really? Like, there were Black people in Albany, in the state capitol, like suggesting new laws and getting them passed. That's sort of where I wanted the book to be like, yes, they were, and it wasn't isolated. And I think the earlier literature, I don't think there was a sort of, we might have been surprised to sort of see that sort of thing happening, but it was happening.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I love this idea of not all historiographic changes are, everybody really missed the whole point. It's actually this. I love the ones that are like, it is all of this incredible work, and here are the new directions that it allows us to go. Just a couple few questions that I'll popcorn at you before we're beginning to get towards the end of our time together. Unfortunately, this has flown by for me. A question about civil suits, and also a question about, during gradual emancipation, how did Black people prove their status as either free or enslaved or born into gradual abolition? Sort of how did that work?
Yeah, so one of the ways that you would prove, there was a number of ways. So in some cases, the reason why those birth certificates and town records were so important is because if someone tried to claim you as a slave or tried to kidnap you and sell you out of state, you would have sort of this record of, no, I was born free. And so those birth certificates have, they're somewhat paradoxical, because on the one hand, they affirm the power of these masters to coerce these children's labor, right? So in some ways, it's like affirming a right of the master. But on the other hand, it's also putting like freedom down on the record. And part of what actually Black parents and mentors try to do is actually, and with sort of white anti-slavery lawyers, is actually catch masters who aren't lodging those birth certificates precisely because there's a fear that that child's freedom would otherwise be in danger. You also will see if someone has freedom papers, they'll lodge a copy with like a local white elite or with the Manumission Society, sort of to have backup, right? Like if someone steals my freedom paper, at least sort of, you know, Alexander Hamilton's lawyer friend knows that I'm free, right? So paperwork, and there's really good work, like I'm thinking of people like Rebecca Scott and others who like just talk about sort of both like the dangers and the powers of having things written down on paper, and also literacy. There are also civil suits. I mean, that's the sort of thing where I think so going back to historiography, sort of this earlier generation of social historians who went into court records in some ways, because for social history reasons, but sort of ended up finding all of these people there. And I think, you know, this is like, I'm also pulling on sort of Laura Edwards, like absolutely outstanding work. Just the ways in which sort of people are using the law and courts sort of far more than, at least when I started grad school, I would have been surprised to see people in court in these ways. And I'll just say last, just as a plug, I have like an absolutely outstanding graduate student. She already has her JD. She's getting her PhD, named Janine Alvarez, who's working on Black plaintiffs and tort law in the late 19th century. But I think, again, just historiographically, I think there's a growing interest in sort of the ways that people are using both civil law and criminal law. Dylan Penning-Ross, outstanding new book. That there's more people using law in the legal system than maybe like I thought there were when I started grad school.
Yeah, I think that's been an exciting insight that I've been sort of grappling with myself, both with Laura Edwards' book and all of these others that you've named, and many more. I think we should probably end it there. Thank you so much. This was such a joy to read. I hope everyone will rush out and buy a copy from their local bookseller. I think it's a really rich and important book for just, you know, graduate students, undergrads, curious people who want to understand this country's past and grapple with really important and complicated questions. So yeah, thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Carolyn. This was so fun. And the very last thing I'll say is if you have a question, I didn't get to it, or you're just curious, I really love people talking to me or emailing me. So if you have questions, please don't feel shy to get in touch over email. I'd be happy to respond. And Jess and Grace, thanks again so much.
Thanks all.
Good night.